You were
Vivian
said.
Martinez
Its
had always
voice carrying
been
an
the type of
authority
person
that
who
seemed to
questioned
come
every
from
centuries of command.
At 28
You
years
have
old, she
trespassed
worked
upon
as a
sacred
freelance
ground,
journalist, specializing
disturbed
in
the ancient
historical
vigil,
mysteries and
and
unexplained
challenged those who
phenomena.
guard the passage
Her
between
apartment
worlds.
in downtown Chicago
Behind
was
her,
filled with books about
Vivian
ancient
could hear Hassan
civilizations
and Elena calling for her to
newspaper
run,
clippings of
but
strange
she felt
events,
rooted in place
and
by a
photographs
combination
from her
of terror
travels
and
to remote
fascination.
archaeological
She was
sites
face to
around the
face
world.
with something that should not
The story
exist.
that would change her life
Something
forever
that
began on a
challenged
rainy
everything she
Tuesday
thought
morning
she
in
knew
October.
about the nature of reality.
Vivian was
What
sitting
are
at
you?
her cluttered desk.
She managed to ask,
sipping her third cup of
The
coffee
figures
while
in human
scrolling
features
through
seemed to
research
shift
emails
into what might have been a
when
smile.
she received a message that
But
made
there
her
was no
heart
warmth
race.
or humor in it.
The email
The
came
moment
from
the Guardian
Dr.
spoke
Elena
those
Vasquez,
words,
a renowned
Vivian felt
archaeologist
something
she had met
fundamental
during a
change
dig
around
in
her.
Peru the previous
The
year.
air became thick and oppressive,
Vivian,
as if the very
the
atmosphere
email
was
read,
pressing down on her
I have
lungs.
something that might
The
interest
darkness
you.
seemed to deepen.
We've
and the
discovered an
familiar sounds
untouched
of the
tomb
desert
in the
valley
valley
of the kings in
completely.
Egypt.
The
Leaving
local
only an
authorities have
unnatural
assigned guards
silence.
to protect it.
What
But
do you
there's
mean?
something strange
Vivian
happening.
asked.
The guards
Her
claim
voice
they've seen
sounding
things,
strange
heard
and
voices,
distant
and
to her
some
own
have even
ears.
quit their posts.
The three
The
Egyptian
Ministry
Ministry
of Tourism is
slowly
keeping this quiet. Their movements
but they
creating
need
patterns
someone
in
to
the air
document
that left
what's really
faint
going
trails
on.
of phosphorescent light.
interested?
Vivian's
The lead
fingers
guardian
trembled
continued
slightly
to
as she
speak,
typed her response.
but now his voice
This was
seemed to come
exactly
from
the kind
inside
of
her
story
head
she
rather
lived
than
for.
from his visible form.
Ancient tombs, mysterious
You have
occurrences,
broken
and
the
the
ancient
chance to uncover
protocols,
truth behind
challenger
legends.
of the threshold.
She had
You
covered
have spoken
similar stories
directly to
before,
those
but
who guard the
nothing
sacred
quite
passage
like
without
this.
invitation.
The Valley of the Kings
Without
was legendary.
preparation,
Without
home to the
understanding
tombs
the
of
consequences
pharaohs and
of your
nobles from
actions,
Egypt's new kingdom
Vivian
period.
tried to step backward. The
To
idea that
retreat
there
to
was
where
still an
Hassan and
undiscovered
Elena were
tomb there
waiting,
was thrilling enough,
but found that her feet
but
would
the
not obey
mysterious
her
circumstances
commands.
surrounding its
She was
discovery
trapped
made
within
it
the circle of the
irresistible.
three guardians.
Within hours,
Held by some force
Vivian
that was
had booked her
stronger
flight
than
to
her physical
Cairo.
will.
She spent
The
the next
mortal
2
world
days
and the
researching
eternal
everything
realm
she
are
could about
separated by
recent
laws
archaeological
older than your
discoveries in
civilization.
Egypt.
The
The history of tomb
continued.
guardianship.
These
and the
laws
cultural
exist to
beliefs
protect
surrounding
both worlds
ancient
from
burial
forces
sites
that would
She
consume
read
them.
about the traditional
By
role of
addressing
tomb
us
guards,
directly,
who were
you
often
have
local
opened a
men
connection
hired to
that
protect
cannot be easily
archaeological sites
closed.
from tomb robbers and
The
vandals.
second guardian
These
spoke.
guards typically worked in
His voice
shifts,
a whisper that
spending long
somehow
hours
carried
alone
clearly
in
through
remote
desert
desert
locations.
She carries the mark
As
of
her
the
plane
seeker.
descended toward
She has
Cairo
spent her life
International
pursuing
Airport,
mysteries. Vivian
pulling
felt
back
a veils
veils
that
that
were
were
meant
meant
to
to
remain
remain
closed.
and nervousness.
This was inevitable. The
What
sprawling
mark?
city stretched
What
out
are you
below
talking
her.
about?
A mixture of
Vivian
ancient
demanded,
minarets
finding
and
her
modern
voice despite
buildings
her
shrouded
fear.
in the golden
The third
haze of
guardian
desert
raised his
dust.
hand, and suddenly Vivian could
She had
see
visited
herself as if
Egypt
from
twice
outside
before
her own body.
but the country never
Around
failed
her
to
physical
amaze her
form
with
was
its
a faint
incredible
aura of
history
golden light,
and the weight
that
of
pulsed in
thousands
rhythm
of
with
years
her
of
heartbeat.
civilization. Within this aura, she could
Dr.
see symbols
Vasquez
and
met her at the
patterns that
airport,
seemed to shift and
looking
change as she
tired,
watched, but enthusiastic.
Every person who seeks to
Elena
uncover
was a
hidden
small
truths
woman in her
leaves
50s with
traces
graying
of their
hair
search
pulled back
upon
in
their
a
spirit.
practical ponytail,
The first guardian
and skin
explained.
weathered by
You have
years of working
investigated
under
many
harsh
mysteries.
desert sun, spoken with many who
As
have
they drove
encountered the
through the chaotic
supernatural,
streets of Cairo
stood
toward
in
their
many
hotel,
places where the veil
Elena
between
filled
worlds is
Vivian
thin
in
on the details of the discovery.
Each experience has marked
We found
you,
the tomb entrance
prepared
3
you,
weeks ago,
drawn you inevitably
Elena
to this
explained,
moment.
navigating around a
Vivian
donkey
felt a
cart
growing
loaded with
sense of
vegetables.
dread as she began
It's
to
about 2
understand what
kilometers
they
from
were
the main
telling her.
tourist areas in the
You're
Valley
saying
of the
this
Kings.
wasn't coincidence?
The entrance was
That I was
completely
somehow
hidden
meant to
under
be here?
centuries of debris
The
and
cosmos
sand.
does not deal in
Initial
coincidence, the
investigation
second guardian
suggested
said.
belongs to a
You
previously
received the
unknown
invitation
noble
to
from
come
the reign
here
of
because you were ready
second.
to receive it. Elena's voice
Dr.
dropped to a
Vasquez
more serious
contacted you
tone,
because forces
but here's
beyond
where it
her
gets
conscious
interesting.
mind guided her
From
to
the
do
first
so.
day we assigned guards
You
to the
accepted
site
because the same
strange
forces
things
have been
started
guiding your
happening.
entire
The
career
first guard
toward
Ahmed
Ahmed
Hassan
Hassan claimed he heard
chanting
chanting
coming
coming
from
from
inside
Vivian
the
like a
sealed
physical
tomb.
blow. He said it
She thought
sounded
about
like
all the
ancient
strange
Egyptian,
stories she had
though he
investigated
doesn't
over
speak
the
the
years.
language. The
The
inexplicable
second guard,
experiences she had
Mahmoud Ali,
documented.
the gradual
Seeing
progression
shadows
from
moving near the
skeptical
entrance when
journalist
there was no one around.
to
Someone who had begun to believe.
Vivian leaned forward in
that
her
there were
seat,
indeed forces
her
in the
journalist
world
instincts
beyond
fully
normal.
engaged.
Understanding. What kind
But
of
I
shadows?
don't want any part of.
He described them
this,
as human-shaped
she said
figures that
desperately.
seemed to glide
I just
rather
wanted
than
to write a
walk.
story about the tomb
When he
guards'
approached to
experiences.
investigate, they would
I
disappear.
never asked to be involved
Both
in
guards
anything
initially thought they
supernatural.
were seeing seeing things due
The
to
first
the heat and
Guardian's
isolation.
inhuman features showed what
But
might
then
have
more
been
guards
sympathy,
reported similar
but it was
experiences.
cold and distant.
The car turned onto
like
a
the
highway
sympathy a
leading
scientist
south
might
toward
feel for a
Luxor,
laboratory
and
specimen.
the landscape gradually
Choices and
changed from
illusion
urban
seeker.
sprawl to rural
You have been
farmland
walking
along
this
the
path
Nile
for
River,
years,
guided
palm
by
trees
forces
swayed
you could
in the
not see or
distance.
understand. And Vivian
Every
could see
story
for
you
you
investigated,
sailing on the
every
ancient
mystery
river
that
that
had
had
been
been
the
the lifeblood
every
of
step
Egyptian
you took into the
civilization
unknown brought you
millennia.
closer to this moment.
The breaking point came
Around
5
them,
days ago.
the desert
The
landscape
landscape
continued.
began to change.
A guard named Kareem
The familiar
Nasser was
rocky
found
terrain
unconscious
dissolved
near the
and
tomb
reformed
entrance.
into something that looked
When he
like
woke
ancient
up,
Egypt.
He claimed that
But
he had
not
been
quite as
approached
it
by
had
a
ever
figure in
existed in the
ancient
physical
Egyptian
world.
clothing who spoke to him in
Massive
perfect
temples
Arabic,
rose from the
warning
sand,
him to leave the
their
tomb
walls
alone.
covered in hieroglyphs
Kareem
that
quit
seemed to
immediately
move
and
and shift
refused
in
to
the
go
uncertain
back.
light.
Even
The sky
when we
above
offered him
showed
double
not the
pay.
familiar stars of the modern night.
Elena pulled out her
but
phone and showed
constellations
Vivian
that
a
had been
photograph
forgotten
of
for
the tomb
millennia.
entrance.
It was a
Where are we?
rectangular opening
Vivian
cut into the
whispered.
limestone cliff
We are in the
face,
space between
barely
worlds,
large enough
the
for a
third
person to
Guardian
crawl
explained.
through.
The opening
place
was
where all
partially
sacred
blocked by
sites
a modern
exist
metal gate
simultaneously
installed by
across
the
time.
archaeological team
Here,
for security.
The tomb you discovered in your
Desert sand had
world
drifted
connects
against
to
the
every
entrance,
burial
and the
place that
surrounding
has ever
area
been
looked
consecrated
desolated
to
and
guard the
forbidding.
passage between
The
life
current guard is a
and
man
death.
named Hassan Abdel
Vivian
Rahman.
could see other
Ilayna
figures
said.
moving in the distance.
He's been working
other
tomb
guardians
security for
maintaining
over
their
15
eternal
years
vigil at other
and
sacred
has never
sites.
reported
Some
anything
appeared to be
unusual
Egyptian,
before.
but
But
others
even he
wore the
admits
clothing
that
and
something
carried the
feels
symbols
different
of
about the site.
civilizations she did not recognize.
He's agreed to
All of
stay
them
on,
moved
but
with
he's
the same
requested that
unnatural
someone else
grace.
be present during
All
his
of them
night shifts.
radiated the same sense
As
of
they
ancient
drove through
authority.
small villages along the Nile,
The tomb you found
Vivian
is not
found
just a
herself
burial
thinking
site,
about the guards
the first
and their
guardian
experiences.
continued.
It is
She
an
had
anchor
encountered
point,
many people during
a
her
place
career
where the
who claimed to
barriers
have
between the
witnessed
mortal world and the
supernatural
eternal
events.
realm are carefully
And she
maintained.
had learned to approach such
For
claims with
3,000
healthy
years we have
skepticism,
kept watch,
while remaining
ensuring that
open to
nothing
the
passes
possibility
through
that should not,
that there might be
explanations
explanations beyond
beyond
the obvious. But now you have challenged us directly.
The sun was setting by the time
second
they
guardian
reached
said.
Luxor. You have spoken
Painting
to
the
us
sky
as
in
equals
brilliant
rather
shades
than
of
showing
orange
the
and
proper
purple.
respect
The
due
ancient
to those
city,
who guard the
built on
cosmic
the site
order.
of Thebes. The
This
capital
act
of
of
ancient
defiance
Egypt
has
during its golden
consequences that
age
extend far
seemed
beyond
to
your
glow in the
individual
dying
fate.
light.
Vivian
Felt
could
panic
see the
rising in her
massive
chest.
columns of
I
Luxor
didn't
temple
know.
rising above
I was
the
just
modern
trying to
buildings.
understand
A
what was
reminder
happening.
of the incredible
I meant no
civilization that has
disrespect.
flourished here over
Ignorance is
3,000
not
years ago.
absolution. The
Their
third
hotel
guardian
was a
said
modest
firmly.
establishment
You are a
catering
seeker
to
of truth,
archaeologists and
one who has made it
researchers
your
rather
life's
than
work to
tourists.
uncover hidden knowledge.
After checking in and
With
having
that
dinner,
choice comes
Elena and
responsibility
Vivian
for the
sat on the
consequences
hotel's
of your
rooftop
discoveries.
terrace, planning their approach
The
to
first
the tomb
guardian
site.
moved closer.
We'll
And
go
Vivian
out
could
tomorrow
feel
morning,
the cold
Elena
radiating
said.
from his form.
I want you to meet Hassan
and see the
You
site
have
for
two
yourself
choices,
before you
challenger.
decide how to proceed
You can
with your
accept the role
investigation.
that your life has prepared you
Vivian
for
nodded
and become one who
looking
helps
out over the
maintain
lights of
balance
Luxor
between worlds.
toward the dark
Or
silhouette
you
of
can
the hills
reject
across
this
the
calling
Nile
and
where
face
the
the
Valley of the Kings
consequences
lay
of leaving
hidden.
the connection you have opened
Somewhere in those
unguarded.
ancient cliffs was a tomb
What kind
that
of
had remained
consequences?
undisturbed for over
Vivian asked,
3,000 years,
though she was
and
afraid
now
to
it
hear the
seemed to
answer.
be affecting everyone
The
who came near
connection
it.
between your world
She had
and ours
no
cannot simply
idea
be
that her
closed.
decision to
The
investigate
second
this
guardian
mystery
explained,
would soon
it
put her
must be
face
either
to face
properly
with
maintained or
forces that
permanently
would challenge
sealed.
everything she
If it
believed
is left
about the
unguarded,
world. Entities
the next
from
morning
both sides
arrived
will
with the
begin to
crystal
cross
clear
over
brilliance
inappropriately.
that only the Egyptian desert
Your world
could
would face
provide.
incursions from beings
Vivian
it is not
woke
prepared
before
to
dawn.
handle. Her internal
While our
clock
realm
still
would be
adjusting to the
contaminated
time
by
difference
mortal
and found
energies
herself
that
unable
disrupt
to
the
go back to
eternal
sleep.
order.
The third
She
guardian
dressed in
gestured toward
practical
the
khaki
transformed
pants,
landscape
a
around them.
long-sleeved cotton
You have
shirt
seen what
and
happens
sturdy
when the
hiking
barriers
boots.
break down
Then
completely.
grabbed her camera bag and notebook.
This is what your world could
Dr.
become if
Vasquez
the
was
cosmic
already
balance
waiting
is
in the
not
hotel
maintained.
lobby.
Looking
Vivian looked
surprisingly
around at the
alert for
surreal
someone who had
environment
been working at the dig
with
site
its
for
impossible
weeks.
architecture
They ate
and
a quick
otherworldly
breakfast of
inhabitants.
flatbread, cheese,
It was beautiful in a
and
way,
strong
but also
Turkish
terrifying
coffee in its complete
before climbing
alienness
into
to
anything
a dusty
human.
jeep for the
She
drive
tried
to
to
the Valley
imagine
of
her
the
own
Kings.
world transformed into something like
The
this
road
and felt
wound
sick
through
with horror.
increasingly barren
But I'm
landscape
just one
as they
person.
left the green strip
She
along the
protested.
Nile behind.
I'm not qualified to guard cosmic
The morning air
balance
was
or
cool,
maintain barriers
but
between
Vivian knew
worlds.
that within a few hours
I'm a
the
journalist,
temperature
not
would
some
climb
kind
to
of mystical
uncomfortable
guardian.
levels. You are more
She had
than you
learned
know.
from previous trips
The
to
first
always carry
guardian
more
said.
water than she
Your
thought
years
she
of
would need.
investigating mysteries have
Tell me
given
more
you
about
insights
Hassan,
that few mortals
Vivian
possess.
said as they bounced
Your
along the rough
willingness
road.
to seek truth
What makes
even
him
when
different
it is
from the other
dangerous or
guards?
uncomfortable.
Elena shifted
Demonstrates
gears to
the
navigate
qualities
around a
necessary for
particularly
this work.
large pothole.
And your presence here. Hassan comes from a
Despite all the
family that
warnings
has worked
and
in tomb
opportunities to
security for
leave,
generations.
shows that you have the courage
His
required.
grandfather guarded
The
royal
second
tombs
guardian
back in the
added,
1920s.
The role does not
and his
require you
father
to
worked
abandon
with
your
Howard
life
Carter's
in the
team
mortal
during
world.
some of the later
You would
excavations
continue
in the
to
valley.
appear normal to others.
Hassan himself has been doing this work since he was 18
but you would
years
also
old.
serve as a bridge between
She paused
worlds,
to wave at a group of
helping to
local
identify
children
and
who
resolve
had run out from a
situations
small
where the
village to watch
supernatural
their
intrudes
jeep pass.
inappropriately
What makes
into
him
mortal
credible is
affairs.
that he's seen everything over the
And
years.
if I refuse?
Tourist
Vivian
pranks,
asked.
attempted break-ins,
The three
even a few
guardians
genuine
exchanged looks that
archaeological
somehow
mysteries.
conveyed volumes of
He's not the type
communication
to
without
imagine
words.
things or make up stories for
Finally,
attention.
the first
When
guardian
Hassan
spoke.
says something unusual is
If you
happening,
refuse, we will be
people
forced to
listen.
close the connection you opened.
The
by
landscape
removing
around
the one
them
who
became
opened it.
increasingly
You would not
dramatic as
die
they
in any
approached
way
the
that
Valley
your
of the
world would
Kings.
understand.
But
towering limestone cliffs in the mortal realm.
desert floor.
Your essence would be
Carved by
absorbed
millions
into
of
the
years of
eternal
wind
watch,
and rare but
bound
intense
forever
flash
to guard
floods.
this threshold.
The rock
but without
formations
consciousness
created
or
an
memory of your
otherworldly
human
landscape
life
that seemed almost alien in
The
its
words
stark
hit
beauty.
Vivian like ice
They
water.
passed the main
She
tourist
realized that
entrance
she
to
was
the
facing
valley,
a choice between
where
accepting
colorful
a role she
signs
never
in
wanted,
multiple languages
or losing
directed
everything
visitors
that
to
made
the
her
famous
who she
tombs
was.
of Tutankhamun.
The Guardians were not making
Grimaces
threats.
of horror and other
They were
well-known
simply explaining the
explosives.
cosmic
But Elena
mechanics of a
continued driving
situation
past
she
the
had stumbled
tourist
into.
area, following
We are
a
the
narrow
eternal
dirt track that
Guardians,
wound deeper
bound
into
to
the
this
desert
sacred
hills.
place until the stars fall
Our
from
site
the
is in
sky.
a section
And
that's
you,
not open
mortal
to the
child,
public.
have
Elena
made a grave
explained.
error in judgment
It's about a
that will
20-minute
cost
hike
you
from
more
where
than
you
you
can
can
park the
imagine.
Jeep. The isolation is part of what makes the guard's experiences so unsettling. When you're alone out there for hours at a time, your mind can start playing tricks on you. After parking the vehicle in the shade of a large boulder, they began the hike to the tomb site. The trail was rough and unmarked, winding between ancient rock formations and over loose scree that shifted under their feet. Vivian was grateful for her hiking boots as they scrambled up and down the rocky terrain. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and occasional calls of desert birds. Vivian had experienced this kind of deep quiet before in remote locations, but there was something about this particular place that felt different. The very air seemed heavy with history and mystery. "There it is," Elena said, pointing ahead to where a small tent and some equipment were visible near the base of a cliff. As they approached the site, Vivian got her first clear view of the tomb entrance. It was exactly as Elena had described, a dark rectangular opening carved into the limestone cliff face. The modern metal gate looked strangely out of place against the ancient stone. Someone had set up a basic camp nearby with a folding chair, a small table, and a canvas shelter to provide shade during the hottest parts of the day. Hassan Abdelrahman emerged from the shelter as they approached. He was a man in his 40s with weathered skin and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His handshake was firm, and he greeted Vivian in excellent English with only a slight accent. "Dr. Vasquez tells me you are here to investigate the strange happenings," Hassan said, his expression serious. "I must tell you honestly, miss, in all my years of doing this work, I have never experienced anything like what has been happening here." Vivian pulled out her notebook and pen. "Can you describe exactly what you've witnessed?" Hassan looked toward the tomb entrance, then back at Vivian. "It began the first night I worked here about 2 weeks ago. I was sitting in my chair, reading by flashlight, when I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from inside the tomb. But this tomb is sealed, you understand. No one has entered it since Dr. Vasquez's team discovered it." He gestured toward the metal gate. "I went to investigate, thinking perhaps some animal had somehow gotten inside. But when I shined my light through the gate, I saw nothing. The footsteps stopped as soon as I approached." Elena nodded. "Hassan reported this to me the next morning, and we thoroughly checked the seal on the gate. It hadn't been disturbed. The second night," Hassan continued, "I heard voices, not footsteps this time, but actual conversation. It sounded like two people speaking in what I think was ancient Egyptian, though I cannot be certain. The voices seemed to be coming from deep within the tomb, far beyond where our lights can reach." Vivian scribbled notes rapidly. "How long did this conversation last?" "Perhaps 10 minutes. I sat very still and listened. The tone seemed argumentative, as if the speakers were disagreeing about something important. Then suddenly silence. Hassan walked closer to the tomb entrance and Vivian followed. Up close, she could see that the gate was secured with a heavy padlock, and the metal frame was set firmly into the rock. There was no way anyone could have entered the tomb without leaving obvious signs. "The third night was when I saw them," Hassan said quietly. "Them?" Vivian asked. "Figures. Human shapes, but not quite right. They appeared near the entrance around midnight, 3 of them. They were tall and moved strangely, as if they were floating rather than walking. They wore what looked like ancient clothing, long robes that seemed to move even though there was no wind." Elena interjected. "Hassan called me immediately after this incident. I drove out here in the middle of the night, but by the time I arrived, there was nothing to see. But I know what I saw," Hassan said firmly. "These were not hallucinations or tricks of light. They were as real as you and I standing here now." Vivian looked around the site, trying to imagine being alone here in the darkness, with only a flashlight for company. The tomb entrance looked particularly ominous, like a dark mouth opening into the earth. She could understand how anyone might feel unsettled in such a place. "Have you experienced anything during daylight hours?" she asked. Hassan shook his head. "Only at night. But even during the day, there is something wrong about this place. You feel watched, as if eyes are upon you constantly, and the temperature near the tomb entrance is always cooler than it should be, even when the sun is directly overhead." To demonstrate his point, Hassan led them to within a few feet of the metal gate. Vivian immediately noticed what he meant. Despite the growing heat of the morning sun, the air near the tomb entrance felt noticeably cooler, almost cold. "Could this be due to air circulation from inside the tomb?" Vivian asked Elena. "That's what I thought initially," Elena replied. "But we've done preliminary measurements, and the temperature difference is more extreme than normal geological conditions would explain." Hassan pulled a thermostat from his pocket. "I have been keeping records. Right now the temperature here in the shade is 32 degrees Celsius. Near the tomb entrance it is 24 degrees. That is not normal. Vivian spent the next hour taking photographs and detailed notes about the site. She documented the tomb entrance from multiple angles, measured distances, and recorded the ambient temperature at various locations around the camp. Everything appeared normal except for the unexplained temperature variation near the gate. As the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher, the heat became increasingly oppressive. Elena suggested they return to town for lunch and come back in the evening when Hassan's shift would begin. "Tonight," Hassan said, "you can see for yourself what happens here after dark. But I warn you, miss, once you have witnessed these things, you will never forget them. Some knowledge cannot be unknown." As they hiked back to the jeep, Vivian found herself looking over her shoulder repeatedly. Hassan's words echoed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was indeed watching them from the shadows of the ancient cliffs. She had come here as a skeptical journalist, ready to find rational explanations for what the guards had experienced. But after only a few hours at the site, she was beginning to understand why so many guards had quit their posts. There was definitely something unusual happening here, something that challenged conventional explanation. The question was whether she was brave enough to find out what it really was. That afternoon, Vivian spent hours in her hotel room researching everything she could find about supernatural experiences at archaeological sites. She read accounts from other tomb guards, archaeologists, and researchers who had reported unexplained phenomena at various ancient Egyptian sites over the past century. What surprised her was how common such reports actually were. From the Valley of the Kings to the temples of Luxor, there was a long history of people experiencing strange sights, sounds, and sensations at locations connected to ancient Egypt's burial practices. Some researchers had attempted to find scientific explanations, pointing to factors like electromagnetic fields, infrasound from wind patterns, or psychological effects of isolation and cultural expectation. But reading through dozens of first-hand accounts, Vivian noticed patterns that were difficult to dismiss as mere imagination or suggestion. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across different time periods and different witnesses who had no contact with each other. People repeatedly described seeing figures in ancient Egyptian clothing, hearing voices speaking in unknown languages, and experiencing dramatic temperature changes near tomb entrances. As the sun began to set, Vivian felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension about returning to the tomb site. She had covered many unusual stories during her career, but she had never been in a position where she might personally witness the phenomena she was investigating. Elena picked her up just as the last light was fading from the sky. They drove back through the desert in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The landscape looked completely different in the darkness, more mysterious and somehow threatening. "Are you nervous?" Elena asked as they parked the jeep. "A little," Vivian admitted. "I've interviewed hundreds of people who claim to have experienced supernatural events, but I've never actually seen anything unexplained myself." "Neither had I, until I started working this site," Elena replied quietly. They made the hike to the tomb by flashlight, following the now familiar trail through the rocky terrain. The beam of Vivian's flashlight created a small circle of visibility in the vast darkness, making the desert around them seem infinite and unknown. Hassan was waiting for them at the camp, looking alert and somewhat tense. He had set up additional seating and had prepared tea in a thermos. The normalcy of these preparations contrasted strangely with the unusual circumstances of their vigil. "How long do we typically have to wait?" Vivian asked, settling into a folding chair positioned to give her a clear view of the tomb entrance. "It varies," Hassan replied. "Sometimes nothing happens at all. Other nights the activity begins as early as 9 o'clock. The most intense experiences have occurred between midnight and 3 in the morning. They sat in the darkness, speaking in quiet voices and sipping tea. Hassan told them stories about his years of tomb guarding, including encounters with tomb robbers, dangerous wildlife, and the occasional lost tourist. His tales helped pass the time and demonstrated his extensive experience and level-headed nature. Around 10:30 they heard the first unusual sound. It was subtle at first, like a faint whisper of wind, but it seemed to be coming from the direction of the tomb entrance rather than from the open desert around them. "Do you hear that?" Hassan asked quietly. Vivian strained her ears and could indeed detect something, a low sound that was almost below the threshold of hearing. It was rhythmic, like breathing or chanting, but too faint to make out clearly. "It's starting," Elena whispered. Over the next several minutes, the sound gradually became more distinct. It did sound like chanting, but in a language none of them recognized. The rhythm was hypnotic, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed both ancient and eerily familiar. Vivian found herself unconsciously leaning forward, trying to hear more clearly. The chanting seemed to be coming from deep within the tomb, far beyond where the sealed entrance should have allowed any sound to travel. "Should we investigate?" she whispered. Hassan shook his head firmly. "We stay here. We observe, but we do not approach when the activity is happening." The chanting continued for about 20 minutes, then abruptly stopped. The silence that followed seemed even more profound than before, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. "Is that it?" Vivian asked after several minutes of quiet. "Sometimes," Hassan replied, "but not usually." As if summoned by his words, a new sound began. This time it was clearly footsteps, slow and deliberate, seeming to pace back and forth near the tomb entrance. But unlike normal footsteps, these made no sound of contact with the ground. They had the rhythm of walking, but without the acoustic properties that feet striking stone should produce. Vivian gripped her flashlight, fighting the urge to shine it toward the sound. Hassan had warned her that any sudden light or movement seemed to make the phenomena stop immediately. The footsteps continued for about 10 minutes, then were joined by voices. Two distinct speakers, both male, engaged in what sounded like an animated conversation. The language was completely foreign to Vivian, but the tones and rhythm suggested they were arguing about something important. "Can you understand any of it?" she whispered to Elena. "A few words, maybe. It sounds like ancient Egyptian, but pronounced differently than modern scholars believe it should be. If I'm hearing correctly, they're discussing something about protection and intruders." The conversation continued for nearly half an hour, with the voices occasionally rising in what seemed to be anger or frustration. At one point, Vivian thought she heard her own name mentioned, though she couldn't be certain. Then around midnight, they saw them. The figures appeared gradually, as if materializing from the darkness near the tomb entrance. At first, they were just slightly darker shadows against the black cliff face, but as Vivian's eyes adjusted, she could make out their forms more clearly. There were 3 of them, tall and imposing, wearing what appeared to be elaborate ancient Egyptian ceremonial clothing. Their movements were graceful but unnatural, seeming to glide rather than walk. Even in the darkness, Vivian could see that their clothing included intricate headdresses and flowing robes that moved independently of any breeze. "My God," she breathed. Barely audible, the figures seemed to be conducting some kind of ritual or ceremony near the tomb entrance. They moved in precise patterns, their gestures deliberate and meaningful. One of them appeared to be holding something in his hands, an object that glinted faintly in the starlight. Vivian realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to breathe normally. Her journalistic instincts were screaming at her to document what she was seeing, but she was afraid any movement would cause the figures to disappear. The ceremony continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 15 minutes. The figures moved around the tomb entrance in a complex pattern, occasionally stopping to make gestures toward the sealed gate. Their voices rose and fell in what seemed to be ritualistic incantations. Then suddenly, one of the figures turned directly toward where Vivian, Elena, and Hassan were sitting. Even at a distance of 30 meters, Vivian felt as if the figure was looking directly at her. The sensation was intensely uncomfortable, like being examined by something that could see far more than just her physical form. The figure raised one arm and pointed directly at their position. The other 2 figures turned to look as well, and Vivian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. "We need to leave," Hassan whispered urgently. "Now." But Vivian found herself unable to move. The figures were approaching their position, moving with that same unnatural gliding motion. As they came closer, she could see more details of their appearance, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The faces beneath the elaborate headdresses were not entirely human. The features were elongated and angular in ways that no living person's face should be. Their eyes were large and dark and seemed to reflect light like an animal's eyes in the darkness. "Vivian," Elena hissed, grabbing her arm. "We have to go." The urgency in Elena's voice finally broke through Vivian's paralysis. She jumped to her feet, but as she did, she made a decision that would prove to be a terrible mistake. Instead of following Hassan and Elena as they began to retreat, Vivian stepped forward toward the approaching figures. Her journalistic instincts overrode her fear and she called out to them in English. "Wait, I want to talk to you. I'm here to learn about this place." The effect was immediate and dramatic. All three figures stopped moving and focused their attention entirely on her. The temperature around them dropped so suddenly that Vivian could see her breath in the air. And then, in perfectly clear English with no trace of accent, one of the figures spoke directly to her. "You dare to address the guardians of the sacred threshold? You dare to intrude upon the eternal watch with your mortal presence?" Vivian's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "I'm a researcher. I want to understand what's happening here." The figure that had spoken moved closer, and Vivian could now see that what she had taken for ceremonial clothing was actually something far more disturbing. The robes seemed to be made of shadows themselves, shifting and moving independently of any fabric. The headdress appeared to be carved from some dark material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. "Understanding is not for the uninvited," the figure said, its voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from centuries of command. "You have trespassed upon sacred ground, disturbed the ancient vigil, and challenged those who guard the passage between worlds." Behind her, Vivian could hear Hassan and Elena calling for her to run, but she felt rooted in place by a combination of terror and fascination. She was face to face with something that should not exist, something that challenged everything she thought she knew about the nature of reality. "What are you?" she managed to ask. The figure's inhuman features seemed to shift into what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth or humor in it. The moment the guardian spoke those words, Vivian felt something fundamental change around her. The air became thick and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on her lungs. The darkness seemed to deepen and the familiar sounds of the desert night disappeared completely, leaving only an unnatural silence. "What do you mean?" Vivian asked, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. The three figures began to circle her slowly, their movements creating patterns in the air that left faint trails of phosphorescent light. The lead guardian continued to speak, but now his voice seemed to come from inside her head rather than from his visible form. "You have broken the ancient protocols, challenger of the threshold. You have spoken directly to those who guard the sacred passage without invitation, without preparation, without understanding the consequences of your actions." Vivian tried to step backward, to retreat to where Hassan and Elena were waiting, but found that her feet would not obey her commands. She was trapped within the circle of the three guardians, held by some force that was stronger than her physical will. "The mortal world and the eternal realm are separated by laws older than your civilization," the guardian continued. "These laws exist to protect both worlds from forces that would consume them. By addressing us directly, you have opened a connection that cannot be easily closed." The second guardian spoke, his voice a whisper that somehow carried clearly through the desert air. "She carries the mark of the seeker. She has spent her life pursuing mysteries, pulling back veils that were meant to remain closed. This was inevitable." "What mark? What are you talking about?" Vivian demanded, finding her voice despite her fear. The third guardian raised his hand, and suddenly Vivian could see herself as if from outside her own body. Around her physical form was a faint aura of golden light that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Within this aura, she could see symbols and patterns that seemed to shift and change as she watched. Every person who seeks to uncover hidden truths leaves traces of their search upon their spirit, the first guardian explained. "You have investigated many mysteries, spoken with many who have encountered the supernatural, stood in many places where the veil between worlds is thin. Each experience has marked you, prepared you, drawn you inevitably to this moment." Vivian felt a growing sense of dread as she began to understand what they were telling her. "You're saying this wasn't coincidence? That I was somehow meant to be here?" "The cosmos does not deal in coincidence," the second guardian said. "You received the invitation to come here because you were ready to receive it. Dr. Vasquez contacted you because forces beyond her conscious mind guided her to do so. You accepted because the same forces have been guiding your entire career toward this encounter." The realization hit Vivian like a physical blow. She thought about all the strange stories she had investigated over the years, the inexplicable experiences she had documented, the gradual progression from skeptical journalist to someone who had begun to believe that there were indeed forces in the world beyond normal understanding. "But I don't want any part of this," she said desperately. I just wanted to write a story about the tomb guards' experiences. I never asked to be involved in anything supernatural. The first guardian's inhuman features showed what might have been sympathy, but it was cold and distant, like the sympathy a scientist might feel for a laboratory specimen. Choice is an illusion seeker. You have been walking this path for years, guided by forces you could not see or understand. Every story you investigated, every mystery you pursued, every step you took into the unknown brought you closer to this moment. Around them, the desert landscape began to change. The familiar rocky terrain dissolved and reformed into something that looked like ancient Egypt, but not quite as it had ever existed in the physical world. Massive temples rose from the sand, their walls covered in hieroglyphs that seemed to move and shift in the uncertain light. The sky above showed not the familiar stars of the modern night, but constellations that had been forgotten for millennia. Where are we? Vivian whispered. We are in the space between worlds, the third guardian explained. The place where all sacred sites exist simultaneously across time. Here, the tomb you discovered in your world connects to every burial place that has ever been consecrated to guard the passage between life and death. Vivian could see other figures moving in the distance, other guardians maintaining their eternal vigil at other sacred sites. Some appeared to be Egyptian, but others wore the clothing and carried the symbols of civilizations she did not recognize. All of them moved with the same unnatural grace. All of them radiated the same sense of ancient authority. The tomb you found is not just a burial site, the first guardian continued. It is an anchor point, a place where the barriers between the mortal world and the eternal realm are carefully maintained. For 3,000 years we have kept watch, ensuring that nothing passes through that should not, that the balance is preserved. But now you have challenged us directly, the second guardian said. You have spoken to us as equals rather than showing the proper respect due to those who guard the cosmic order. This act of defiance has consequences that extend far beyond your individual fate. Vivian felt panic rising in her chest. I didn't know. I was just trying to understand what was happening. I meant no disrespect. Ignorance is not absolution, the third guardian said firmly. You are a seeker of truth, one who has made it your life's work to uncover hidden knowledge. With that choice comes responsibility for the consequences of your discoveries. The first guardian moved closer, and Vivian could feel the cold radiating from his form like winter air. You have two choices, Challenger. You can accept the role that your life has prepared you for and become one who helps maintain the balance between worlds. Or you can reject this calling and face the consequences of leaving the connection you have opened unguarded. What kind of consequences? Vivian asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. The connection between your world and ours cannot simply be closed, the second guardian explained. It must be either properly maintained or permanently sealed. If it is left unguarded, entities from both sides will begin to cross over inappropriately. Your world would face incursions from beings it is not prepared to handle, while our realm would be contaminated by mortal energies that disrupt the eternal order. The third guardian gestured toward the transformed landscape around them. You have seen what happens when the barriers break down completely. This is what your world could become if the cosmic balance is not maintained. Vivian looked around at the surreal environment, with its impossible architecture and otherworldly inhabitants. It was beautiful in a way, but also terrifying in its complete alienness to anything human. She tried to imagine her own world transformed into something like this and felt sick with horror. But I'm just one person, she protested. I'm not qualified to guard cosmic balance or maintain barriers between worlds. I'm a journalist, not some kind of mystical guardian. You are more than you know, the first guardian said. Your years of investigating mysteries have given you insights that few mortals possess. Your willingness to seek truth even when it is dangerous or uncomfortable demonstrates the qualities necessary for this work. And your presence here, despite all the warnings and opportunities to leave, shows that you have the courage required. The second guardian added, the role does not require you to abandon your life in the mortal world. You would continue to appear normal to others, continue your work as a journalist, but you would also serve as a bridge between worlds, helping to identify and resolve situations where the supernatural intrudes inappropriately into mortal affairs. And if I refuse? Vivian asked. The three guardians exchanged looks that somehow conveyed volumes of communication without words. Finally, the first guardian spoke. If you refuse, we will be forced to close the connection you opened by removing the one who opened it. You would not die in any way that your world would understand, but you would cease to exist in the mortal realm. Your essence would be absorbed into the eternal watch, bound forever to guard this threshold but without consciousness or memory of your human life. The words hit Vivian like ice water. She realized that she was facing a choice between accepting a role she never wanted or losing everything that made her who she was. The Guardians were not making threats. They were simply explaining the cosmic mechanics of a situation she had stumbled into. We are the Eternal Guardians, bound to this sacred place until the stars fall from the sky. And you, mortal child, have made a grave error in judgment that will cost you more than you can imagine. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, Vivian walked slowly toward the tomb entrance where the three Guardians waited. Each step felt momentous, as if she were crossing an invisible bridge from one version of her life to another. Elena and Hassan followed at a respectful distance, understanding that this final decision had to be hers alone. The desert air was cool and still, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath for her answer. When she reached the Guardians, they turned their inhuman faces toward her in unison. In the growing light, she could see them more clearly than before, and what she saw both terrified and awed her. They were not merely supernatural beings. They were embodiments of ancient principles, living representations of forces that had shaped human civilization for millennia. I have made my decision, Vivian said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Speak, the first Guardian commanded. I accept the role, she said. I accept the responsibility of serving as a bridge between worlds. The moment the words left her lips, Vivian felt a fundamental change begin within her. It started as a warm sensation in her chest, like sunlight spreading through her entire body. But as the feeling intensified, she realized it was far more than physical warmth. Knowledge began flowing into her mind, not as memories, but as sudden understanding of things she had never learned. She could suddenly comprehend the ancient Egyptian words the Guardians spoke, could see the invisible connections between the supernatural experiences she had investigated over the years, could perceive the delicate balance that existed between the mortal world and the realm of eternal forces. The transformation has begun, the second Guardian said. You will retain your human nature and your mortal life, but you will also gain abilities and responsibilities that few mortals have ever carried. Vivian felt her vision changing, expanding beyond normal human perception. She could now see the energy fields that surrounded all living things, could perceive the network of connections that linked supernatural sites around the world, could sense the presence of otherworldly entities even when they tried to hide. With these gifts come obligations, the third Guardian warned. You will be called upon to investigate disturbances in the cosmic balance, to mediate between worlds when conflicts arise, to protect both mortal and immortal realms from forces that would corrupt them. The physical world around Vivian seemed to shimmer and become more vivid. Colors were more intense. Sounds carried layers of meaning she had never detected before, and the very air seemed alive with currents of invisible energy. How will I know when I'm needed? She asked. You will know, the first Guardian replied. The same instincts that have guided your career as an investigator will now serve a larger purpose. You will be drawn to places and situations where your intervention is required. Elena and Hassan approached cautiously, their faces filled with concern and wonder. Are you all right? Elena asked. Vivian turned to look at her friend and gasped. She could now see Elena's aura clearly, a complex pattern of light that revealed her emotions, her health, her spiritual state, and even hints of her personal history. The ability was overwhelming at first, but somehow she instinctively knew how to control and interpret what she was seeing. I'm different, Vivian said honestly, but I think I'm still me. Hassan nodded slowly. You carry the mark now, he said. I can see it. My grandfather described it to me many times, but I never thought I would witness it myself. The Guardians began to fade as the sun rose higher, but their voices remained clear. Your training will come through experience, the first Guardian said. Trust your instincts, but remember that your actions now carry consequences beyond the mortal world. We will be watching, the second Guardian added. When you need guidance, seek us at places where the barriers between worlds are thin. The tomb will remain under our protection, the third Guardian concluded. Your first responsibility is to ensure that its secrets are preserved, while allowing appropriate scholarly study to proceed. As the Guardians disappeared completely, Vivian felt a profound sense of both loss and anticipation. The choice had been made and there was no going back. But looking at the world through her enhanced perception, she began to understand the incredible opportunity she had been given. The drive back to Luxor was surreal. Vivian could see the spiritual history of the landscape laid out before her like an open book. Every temple, every village, every section of desert carried layers of meaning and memory that were now visible to her enhanced perception. "What happens now?" Elena asked as they reached the hotel. "Now I learn how to do this job," Vivian replied. "And I suspect my first assignment is going to be helping you figure out how to study that tomb without disturbing the forces that guard it." Over the following days, Vivian worked with Elena and the Egyptian authorities to develop a research protocol that honored both scientific inquiry and supernatural reality. Using her new abilities, she could sense which areas of the tomb were safe to explore and which should remain undisturbed. The tomb, it turned out, contained remarkable artifacts and inscriptions, but it also served as a genuine gateway between worlds. With Vivian's guidance, the archaeological team was able to conduct their research while maintaining the cosmic balance that the Guardians protected. Hassan became Vivian's first partner in her new role. His family's traditional knowledge combined with her enhanced abilities proved to be a powerful combination for dealing with supernatural situations. 3 weeks after her transformation, Vivian received her first official assignment when Elena contacted her about strange occurrences at another archaeological site near Aswan. A team of archaeologists had uncovered what appeared to be a cursed artifact, and several team members had fallen seriously ill under mysterious circumstances. As Vivian traveled south along the Nile toward her first case as a Guardian investigator, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. She was still a journalist in many ways, still driven by curiosity and the desire to uncover truth. But now her work served a purpose far greater than any story she had ever written. The landscape of the Nile Valley passed by outside her train window, but now she could see it as it truly was, a living tapestry of ancient energy and modern life, a place where the supernatural and the mundane existed in careful balance. Her job was to help maintain that balance, to serve as a bridge between worlds that most people never even knew existed. It was a responsibility she had never asked for, but as the train carried her toward her first assignment, Vivian realized it was also the role she had been unconsciously preparing for her entire career. Every story she had investigated, every mystery she had pursued, had been training for this moment. She thought about the Guardian's words about choice being an illusion. Perhaps they were right, and her path had been predetermined by forces beyond her understanding. But sitting on that train, armed with abilities and knowledge she was only beginning to comprehend, Vivian felt more free than she ever had before. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just documenting mysteries. She was actively participating in the cosmic order that gave them meaning. She wasn't just observing the supernatural. She was helping to govern its interaction with the mortal world. As the train approached Aswan and her first official case, Vivian Martinez prepared to step fully into her new role as a guardian of the threshold between worlds. The journalist in her was eager to investigate the cursed artifact and help the archaeological team. But the guardian in her was ready to face whatever forces had been disturbed and ensure that the balance between worlds remained intact. Her transformation was complete, but her real work was just beginning. The archaeological site near Aswan was in chaos when Vivian arrived. Dr. Marcus Webb, the British archaeologist leading the expedition, met her at the small field station with dark circles under his eyes and a haunted expression that she had seen many times before in people dealing with supernatural phenomena. "Thank God Elena sent you," he said, shaking her hand with obvious relief. "I've been in archaeology for 25 years and I've never encountered anything like this." As they walked toward the excavation site, Dr. Webb explained what had happened. His team had been working on uncovering what appeared to be a minor nobleman's tomb from the Ptolemaic period when they discovered a chamber that didn't appear on any of their ground-penetrating radar scans. "The chamber was hidden behind a false wall," he said. "When we broke through, we found a single artifact sitting on a stone pedestal in the center of the room. It's a ceremonial dagger, beautifully crafted, but the moment we removed it from the chamber, things started going wrong. Vivian could sense the disturbance even before they reached the excavation site. Her enhanced perception picked up waves of malevolent energy radiating from the area, like heat waves rising from desert sand. Whatever they had uncovered was actively hostile to human presence. "What kind of things going wrong?" she asked. Though she suspected, she already knew the answer. 3 team members have collapsed with no apparent medical cause. They're conscious but seem to be in some kind of waking nightmare state. They keep talking about being hunted by something they can't see. "Our equipment has been malfunctioning constantly, and everyone who spends more than an hour near the artifact reports feeling watched and threatened." As they approached the main excavation tent, Vivian could see the artifact Dr. Webb had described. The ceremonial dagger was indeed beautiful, crafted from some dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The handle was decorated with hieroglyphs that her new knowledge allowed her to read instantly. What she read made her blood run cold. "Dr. Webb," she said urgently, "you need to evacuate everyone from this site immediately." "What? Why? We've invested months of work here, and the artifact is incredibly valuable from a historical perspective." Vivian grabbed his arm and pointed toward the dagger. "That's not just a ceremonial weapon. According to the inscriptions, it's a soul-cutting blade, designed to sever the connection between a person's spirit and their physical body. It was used in ancient Egyptian necromantic rituals to create servants who existed between life and death." Dr. Webb's face went pale. "Servants? You mean like zombies?" "Worse," Vivian replied. "The ancient Egyptians believed that a person whose soul was cut with this blade would become a shade, trapped between worlds, and compelled to serve whoever wielded the dagger. The 3 team members who collapsed aren't just having nightmares. The blade is trying to cut their souls away from their bodies." Using her enhanced perception, Vivian could see the truth of the situation more clearly than she wanted to. Invisible tendrils of dark energy were extending from the dagger toward every person in the area, probing for weaknesses in their spiritual defenses. The 3 collapsed team members had been the most vulnerable, and the process of soul severing had already begun in them. "But the blade isn't being wielded by anyone," Dr. Webb protested. "It's just sitting on the examination table." "It doesn't need to be actively used," Vivian explained. "This type of artifact was designed to function automatically once removed from its protective containment. The chamber where you found it was probably warded with protective spells that kept it dormant." As if responding to their conversation, the dagger began to emit a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground. The temperature around the examination table dropped noticeably, and frost began forming on the metal surfaces nearby. "We need to get everyone out of here now," Vivian said, but even as she spoke, she realized it might be too late. The 3 affected team members suddenly stood up from their cots in perfect unison, their movements mechanical and unnatural. Their eyes were open but empty, staring at nothing. When they spoke, it was in the same voice, though their mouths moved out of sync with the words. "The harvest begins," they said in chorus. "The master of the blade calls for servants." Dr. Webb backed away in terror. "What's happening to them?" "The soul-cutting process is accelerating," Vivian said grimly. "If we don't stop this soon, they'll be lost forever, and the dagger will start affecting everyone else." The possessed team members began walking toward the examination table where the dagger lay. Vivian realized that if they reached the artifact, they would become its permanent vessels, able to wield its power to affect others. Without thinking, she stepped between the possessed archaeologists and the dagger. The moment she did, all 3 turned their empty stare toward her, and she felt the full force of the artifact's malevolent attention focus on her. "The Guardian stands before us," the possessed team members said. "She who bridges worlds seeks to deny us our harvest." Vivian felt the dagger's power pressing against her mind, trying to find a way to sever her soul as it had done to the others. But her transformation by the Guardians had given her protections that ordinary humans didn't possess. The artifact's power slid off her spiritual defenses like water off glass. "You cannot touch me," she said firmly. "I am under the protection of the Eternal Guardians, and I command you to release these people." The possessed team members tilted their heads in unison, like predators evaluating a threat. "The Guardian is strong, but she is alone. The Master of the Blade has claimed these servants, and through them, will claim others." Vivian realized that direct confrontation wasn't going to work. The dagger's power was too strong, and she was still learning how to use her new abilities. She needed a different approach. "Dr. Webb," she called without taking her eyes off the possessed archaeologists. "Where exactly was the dagger positioned in the chamber when you found it?" "On a stone pedestal in the exact center of the room," he replied. "Why?" "Because that pedestal was probably more than just a display stand. It was likely a containment focus designed to keep the blade's power dormant." Vivian began moving slowly around the edge of the tent, keeping herself between the possessed team members and the dagger while she examined the artifact more closely. Using her enhanced perception, she could see the energy patterns around the blade more clearly. There were indeed traces of containment magic still clinging to it, but they were fading rapidly as the artifact adjusted to being removed from its protective environment. "We need to recreate the containment field," she said, "but I'll need help from someone who understands the archaeological context." Dr. Webb looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "I'm an archaeologist, not a magician." "You don't need to be a magician," Vivian explained. "You just need to help me understand the original placement and orientation of the artifact." The ancient Egyptians were master engineers. The containment system they built was based on precise mathematical and geometric principles. The possessed team members were getting closer, moving with slow but determined steps. Vivian could see that the soul-cutting process was accelerating in all three of them. Soon they would be completely lost, transformed into permanent servants of the malevolent artifact. "The pedestal," Dr. Webb said suddenly. "It wasn't just centered in the room. It was positioned at the exact intersection of diagonal lines carved into the floor, and there were 4 smaller stones at the corners of the chamber, each one carved with different hieroglyphs." Vivian smiled grimly. "Cornerstones. Classic Egyptian protective geometry. The dagger was held in a pyramid of spiritual force, with the 4 cornerstones anchoring the containment field." She looked around the excavation tent, trying to figure out how to recreate the ancient containment system with modern materials. The possessed archaeologists were now only a few feet away, and she could feel the dagger's power growing stronger as they approached it. "Do you have the cornerstones here?" she asked. "They're in the cataloging tent," Dr. Webb replied. "But even if we bring them here, how do we know the right positions and orientations?" "Because I can see the energy patterns," Vivian said, her enhanced perception showing her the faint traces of the original containment field still clinging to the dagger. "Get the stones quickly, and find me a piece of chalk or anything I can use to mark positions on the ground." As Dr. Webb ran to get the cornerstones, Vivian faced the approaching possessed team members. She knew she had only minutes before they reached the dagger, and the situation became irreversible. "I know you can hear me in there," she said to the 3 archaeologists. "I know your souls are still connected to your bodies. Fight back. Don't let this ancient evil steal what makes you who you are." For just a moment she saw a flicker of recognition in their eyes, a hint that the real people were still trapped inside their possessed bodies. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her hope that they could still be saved, if she could recreate the containment field in time. Dr. Webb returned with the 4 cornerstones just as the possessed team members reached the examination table where the dagger lay. Vivian could see the artifact's dark energy surging in anticipation of bonding permanently with its new servants. "Place the stones exactly where I tell you," she commanded, using her enhanced perception to locate the precise positions where the ancient containment field would be strongest. "And whatever happens, don't look directly at the possessed archaeologists. The dagger is using them as conduits, and eye contact could make you vulnerable." Working with desperate efficiency, Vivian guided Dr. Webb in positioning the cornerstones while she used chalk to mark connecting lines on the tent floor. The geometric pattern had to be perfect, recreating the same spiritual architecture that had kept the soul-cutting blade dormant for over 2,000 years. As the containment field began to take shape, the possessed archaeologists suddenly turned away from the dagger and focused their attention entirely on Vivian and Dr. Webb. The artifact was directing them to stop the recreation of its prison, the interlopers. "Seek to bind the master," they said in their shared voice. "They will not succeed. The harvest must continue." The 3 figures moved with inhuman coordination, spreading out to surround Vivian and Dr. Webb. But as they approached the chalk lines marking the containment geometry, something unexpected happened. They stopped abruptly as if hitting an invisible barrier. "It's working," Dr. Webb exclaimed. "Partially," Vivian corrected. "The field is forming, but it's not complete yet. We need to activate the cornerstones with the proper incantations. She approached the first cornerstone, reading the hieroglyphs carved into its surface. Her enhanced knowledge translated the ancient Egyptian text instantly, revealing words of binding and protection that had been old when the pyramids were built. By the authority of Thoth, master of words, I invoke the binding of the eastern corner, she said, speaking the ancient incantation with careful precision. The cornerstone began to glow with faint blue light. As she moved to the second stone, the possessed archaeologists began to struggle against the invisible barrier that held them. Their movements became increasingly frantic, and cracks appeared in the tent ground beneath their feet as the dagger's power fought against the forming containment field. By the authority of Ptah, master of creation, I invoke the binding of the southern corner, Vivian continued. The second stone flared to life and the blue light began to spread along the chalk lines connecting the corners. The possessed team members were now making inhuman sounds, their voices blending into a harmonic that hurt to hear. The dagger on the examination table was vibrating so rapidly that it was becoming a blur, and the temperature in the tent dropped so low that both Vivian and Dr. Webb could see their breath. By the authority of Sobek, master of the waters, I invoke the binding of the western corner, Vivian said, activating the third stone. The containment field was now 3/4 complete, and she could see its effects on the possessed archaeologists. Their movements were becoming less coordinated, and flickers of human consciousness were appearing in their eyes. But as she approached the fourth and final cornerstone, the dagger made a last desperate attempt to complete its soul-harvesting process. A wave of pure, malevolent energy erupted from the artifact, washing over everyone in the tent like invisible fire. Dr. Webb collapsed to his knees, his face contorted in pain. I can't. Something's trying to get into my head. Vivian felt the attack as well, but her guardian protections held against the assault. However, she could see that the possessed archaeologists were being burned away by the dagger's desperate surge of power. If she didn't complete the containment field immediately, the artifact would consume their souls entirely rather than let them be freed. By the authority of Isis, master of magic, I invoke the binding of the northern corner and the completion of the eternal prison, she shouted, pouring all of her will and newfound power into the final incantation. The fourth cornerstone blazed to life, and instantly, the entire containment field snapped into place with an almost audible crack. The blue light connecting the stones became a solid barrier of spiritual energy, forming a pyramid of force with the dagger trapped at its apex. The effect on the possessed archaeologists was immediate and dramatic. They collapsed as if their strings had been cut, their bodies convulsing as their severed souls snapped back into connection with their physical forms. The dagger's inhuman screaming cut off abruptly, and the artifact itself seemed to diminish, becoming just an ancient metal blade rather than a conduit for malevolent power. Vivian rushed to check on the 3 archaeologists, using her enhanced perception to examine their spiritual conditions. Their souls had been damaged by the severing process, but they were intact and reconnecting properly with their bodies. Are they going to be all right? Dr. Webb asked, helping one of the team members sit up. They'll recover, Vivian said with relief, but they're going to need time to heal from the spiritual trauma. I'd recommend they avoid any archaeological work for at least a month, and they should definitely stay away from any sites that might contain supernatural artifacts. Dr. Webb looked at the contained dagger, now safely imprisoned within the blue light of the recreated containment field. What do we do with it now? The containment field will hold as long as the cornerstones remain in position, Vivian explained. But this artifact is too dangerous to study with conventional archaeological methods. It needs to be turned over to specialists who understand how to handle supernatural objects safely. Over the following hours, Vivian worked with Dr. Webb to arrange for the proper disposition of the soul-cutting blade. There were, she learned, secret networks of scholars and guardians who specialized in dealing with dangerous mystical artifacts. Her new role as a bridge between worlds gave her access to these networks for the first time. As the sun set over the Nile, Vivian sat with Dr. Webb at the field station, watching the river flow past as it had for thousands of years. The immediate crisis was over, but she knew this was just the beginning of a much larger responsibility. How many more artifacts like this are out there? Dr. Webb asked. More than you'd want to know, Vivian replied honestly. Ancient civilizations understood forces that modern science has forgotten. Every major archaeological site in the world, probably contains at least one object that could cause serious problems if handled incorrectly. Dr. Webb shook his head in amazement. I've been an archaeologist for decades, and I thought I understood the risks of my profession. Now I realize I've been walking through a minefield without even knowing it. That's why people like me exist now, Vivian said, to help bridge the gap between archaeological science and supernatural reality. Your work is incredibly important, but it needs to be done with an understanding of the forces that ancient peoples took for granted. As they talked, Vivian reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had gone from being a journalist who wrote about other people's supernatural experiences to being someone who actively intervened in situations where the mystical and mundane worlds collided. The three possessed archaeologists were sleeping peacefully now, their souls properly reconnected to their bodies and their minds healing from the trauma. The soul-cutting dagger was safely contained, waiting to be transported to specialists who could study it without risking their spiritual integrity. But most importantly, Vivian had successfully completed her first assignment as a Guardian investigator. She had proven to herself and to the cosmic forces that had chosen her that she could handle the responsibilities of her new role. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Elena. Strange reports coming in from a dig site in Peru. Ancient Incan temple. Workers claiming to hear music from empty chambers. Sound familiar? Could use your expertise. Vivian smiled as she read the message. Her next assignment was already calling. Another situation where someone with her unique combination of journalistic skills and supernatural knowledge would be needed. She had challenged the Tomb Guardians and instantly regretted it. But that moment of fear and uncertainty had led her to a purpose larger than anything she had ever imagined. She was no longer just documenting mysteries. She was helping to maintain the delicate balance between worlds that most people never even knew existed. As she packed her equipment and prepared to leave for Peru, Vivian Martinez embraced her new identity as a bridge between the ordinary and the extraordinary. The journalist in her was eager to investigate the musical mystery at the Incan temple, but the Guardian in her was ready to face whatever ancient forces had been awakened and ensure that both the archaeological team and the spiritual equilibrium of the site remained protected. Her transformation from skeptical investigator to supernatural Guardian was complete, but her work was just beginning. In a world where ancient mysteries were constantly being uncovered, and modern people lacked the knowledge to handle them safely, there would always be a need for someone who could stand between worlds and help maintain the cosmic balance. Vivian had found her true calling, and despite the dangers and responsibilities it entailed, she had never felt more alive or more purposeful. The Guardians had been right about one thing: choice was indeed an illusion. But